For decades, many African Americans have had an ill feeling toward the criminal justice system. There have been numerous cases of the system treating African Americans poorly, some cases being documented and some being undocumented. The purpose of the criminal justice system is to deliver justice to those who have committed crimes and to protect citizens. However, many blacks feel like the system doesn't do that for them.
I feel like the system was definitely created against the black people and to definitely protect the white person. I do believe that.
I really thought I was gonna be shot that day by the police. And this back then when like Trayvon Martin and Michael Brown got shot. I never thought that would actually happen to me or people around me.
Being black make me uncomfortable around law enforcement. I would say it gives me a bit of pause. It makes me so I'm very cautious.
Again, as I mentioned earlier, show me a decade to where there wasn't police brutality in poor black and brown neighborhoods, then maybe I'll learn something.
The 60s was a decade of very challenging times for black people in law enforcement. There was a plethora of things going on during this decade.
Okay, so the 60s was a very complex time for African Americans in law enforcement. Of course, the 60s is the era of the Black Freedom Movement. You have the Civil Rights Movement beginning.
We're still going through the police brutality system, but because of the civil rights system, it starts to get more notice, especially when you have stuff like the nonviolence movement, and we see police brutality in a different way because police are being used as a vehicle to maintain segregation.
And I think there's always been a level of distrust, given that most of the police officers or the law enforcement were white Americans.
So it varies in the fact that for the first time, it's starting to be seen outside of the South. It's starting to be known in the North. It's starting to be seen internationally, especially when we start talking about Birmingham. For the first time, people are seeing a lot of times the links that people are going to maintain the status quo of Jim Crow laws. And so that's changed because most people weren't really aware of that.
You know, the police were there, of course. They were usually not advocates or supporters of the movement. They were usually considered an occupying force by civil rights activists. For example, in 1960, when you have the student sit-ins, the police are the ones that come and haul the students off to jail.
Relations with law enforcement have always been challenging. If we think about the civil rights movement in the 60s, especially in the American South, but also in the Midwest, in places like Chicago, where I'm from, you had police involved in basically trying to disrupt and discourage protests. So tragically, law enforcement was not seen as being on the side of people who were fighting for rights and opportunities.
It's one thing to hear about it. It's another thing to see it with your own eyes when people are having hoses on children and stuff like that, or police dogs and stuff like that. Those are just things a lot of people weren't used to or could at least try their best to ignore.
In the 60s, African Americans were trying to really determine what their place was and who they could trust. Because historically, African Americans could not or were encouraged not to trust any white people. So given that law enforcement, the majority were from the white population, there was just an automatic level of distrust. And then when any incidents happened, that further attenuated that belief. And so I think a large part of the relationship was rooted in some of the historical things that had happened and how some of the individuals who ended up in law enforcement were afforded those opportunities, not necessarily based on their education or skills, but who they knew.
Also, 1963, during the Birmingham campaign, which is probably one of the most notorious campaigns, when you see school children who are marching in protest of segregation are actually attacked by the police with batons. They're attacked by police dogs. They're also sprayed with high-powered water hoses. So that definitely did not shine a very positive light on law enforcement. It drew a lot of criticism. Sometimes law enforcement, people within law enforcement were responsible for the deaths of civil rights activists, such as Freedom Summer in 1964, when 3 civil rights activists go missing. Eventually, it was found out that some of the people that took part in their murder were local deputies and sheriffs who were also members of the Ku Klux Klan.
At the same time, we can say that this was probably the first period in American history where we actually saw some breakthroughs in law enforcement, where African Americans were hired to work in police departments in major cities. You might be aware of this history, though, however, that in some cases where they were hired, they were restricted and were only allowed to police in Black communities, were not allowed to arrest white citizens for crimes. So even though there was progress, there were still some limitations.
I would say that there were some victories, but there was also a lot of hurdles, because every time that you try to accomplish, there's always going to be opposition to that.
Unfortunately, my father in the city of Chicago had a bad experience with police. My father had what was considered a nice car at the time. It was a Buick, and I guess the law enforcement officer, the white policeman in the city of Chicago, saw him, stopped him for no apparent reason. He hadn't done anything wrong. And when my father inquired why he was being stopped, the officer put a gun to his head, basically. And fortunately, there was a Black officer in another car who was coming by and saw this and quickly dissolved the situation.
We're looking at policing. I think that it's been designed to particularly target poor people, and it makes it even worse if you're brown and Black, and I don't care what decade you look at.
When I think of how far things were going, it to me just didn't start with just the police. It started with like the government all the way down. For example, my favorite story is actually in 1970-71 when you have the issue of Angela Davis in California. And you have the concept of not just connecting like the police system to the prison system and the prison industrial complex. So back then you had the Soledad brothers who were in prison. And of course, Angela Davis at that time has a relationship with George Jackson, and George Jackson gets killed.
California Adult Authority inmate A63837, imprisoned January 12, 1960. Offense, second-degree robbery.
Convicted of stealing $72 from a petrol station, Jackson had a juvenile record. He was advised to plead guilty to get a lighter sentence. The three, George Jackson, Fleeta Drumgo, and John Cliché, became known as the Soledad brothers.
August 21, 1971, San Quentin. 3 guards and 2 prisoners killed in an alleged escape attempt. George Jackson shot dead.
So George Jackson gets killed, and his brother Jonathan comes into the court and tries to take over a courtroom in order to protest how his brothers died. Things get out of hand. Some people get killed, including Jonathan himself. But because people had such issues with Angela Davis and her politics, they used the police system as a way to make her an accomplice to it.
The killing of the judge was, and I know I'm going through all of these details, but I think they may matter at this moment, that the killing of the judge happened as a reflex after Jonathan Jackson was already killed. And as a matter of fact, during my trial, we cross-examined some of the San Quentin guards who testified. And I'll never forget, one of my attorneys said, well, is it true that San Quentin prison authorities have instructed you to prevent an escape attempt at any cost? And the answer was yes.
And because her name was named part of who bought the gun, or was somehow they attached her name to the gun itself that was used in the killing. They said in herself that made her not just an accomplice, but they also tried to try her for first-degree murder. And so when things like that, when you see a government system that's trying to literally, they put her on her life on trial for her life. When you see a black woman, because of her views, because of what she's trying to do, being literally charged with first-degree murder because of her attachment to something, because of her attachment of trying to protest against the ways are in a penal system, and being taught literally her government system from the governor, who at that time is Ronald Reagan, all the way down, trying to actually execute this woman for this crime. It shows how people in charge, people who have the most power, are using the police system as a tool to oppress, to have their own viewpoints become the norm.
There were many civil rights activists in the 60s who were only trying to promote peace and equality for black people. Even while holding peaceful protests, many people in the system still attempted to try and make them look bad.
The FBI actually, I believe, started. They got their start by doing surveillance on communists during the Cold War. And then eventually, when the 60s came, they started, monitoring this emerging civil rights movement and its leaders.
FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, and I would say COINTELPRO, where, they had specific strategies to tear down or dismantle any type of progress that African Americans were making.
The Panthers, basically the whole goal of COINTELPRO was to disrupt or basically eliminate any black freedom movement organizations, also to discredit any leaders, to make people kind of lose hope and faith in these leaders. And the whole goal of that was because they feared a black, what J. Edgar Hoover would call a black messiah, which was basically fearing a black leader that was able to unite black different groups.
Very disheartening to know that someone who was in a position of power, such as J. Edgar Hoover, would make an assumption or believe reports about King being affiliated with communists. But I think a large part of that was fabricated just to try to minimize the effect that King was having, and the fact that he had a significant following and was potentially going to affect the way that we live and affect the power structure. Really, people were looking for anything to discredit him.
There was never any evidence that came out that Dr. King was a communist. Usually, communist, that was kind of a derogatory word during that time. Like, if you seem kind of un-American or unpatriotic, if you criticize the United States in any kind of way, if you, criticize capitalism, American racism in any kind of way, you were going to be called a communist.
Hoover did that for a lot of people during that time period. So my story is about how COINTELPRO and how Hoover oppressed people like Martin Luther King kind of spreads out to even more common citizens like poet Sonia Sanchez.
People don't know that a number of people lost jobs. People don't know that I was pushed out of New York City because of my politics and because of how I couldn't get a teaching job. Now that's how I made my living.
And she talks about how the FBI comes to her home simply because she's teaching these things to black people. So they really were in a place where they were trying to oppress people and keep them in a certain place. So it saddens me that our system is used in that way to oppress us, but it doesn't surprise me.
When we think about what the FBI did under J. Edgar Hoover, it's just astonishing that you would have someone who has a building named after them in Washington, D.C., who was over a law enforcement agency who apparently had disregard for the law.
It really saddened me that people were evil enough to create or fabricate things just to get what they wanted.
It speaks to our very complex history of people being seen as outstanding leaders in American history, but who were basically, convicting heinous crimes against citizens.
There were a lot of different groups that were formed that were trying to create unity in many different ways, many different strategies.
In 1963, when Dr. King was attempting to lead peaceful protest and law enforcement went to the extreme of allowing dogs and fire water hoses on the people, really goes to show that people who have hate in their heart will do anything to stop progress from being made.
Today, I have stood where once Jefferson Davis stood and took an oath to my people. It is very appropriate that from this cradle of the Confederacy, this very heart of the great Anglo-Saxon Southland, that today we sound the drum for freedom, and I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
Birmingham during that time was probably one of the most segregated cities in the South. It was also one of the most violent cities in the South. It was actually known as Birmingham. That was the nickname because so many black institutions, black churches, black homes of black leaders were bombed.
And for that one specifically, you also have Ralph Abernathy, that's also a pastor in Atlanta, that's also heavily involved in the planning. And if you do some research on it, especially if you look at the King Papers or the King Institute website, they'll talk about the fact that that was a challenge to them because they didn't have as much money, because they knew they had to have money for bail because your people are going to get arrested.
SCLC wanted to do a campaign there to try to end segregation, to try to open up some of the jobs downtown to African Americans. And so they began a campaign of sit-ins, marches, things of that nature. Eventually, so many of the adult leaders were getting locked up that they decided to look towards elementary school children, towards high school children, college students to begin marching. So they trained them in nonviolence, and that's what we see when we see that footage of them, getting sprayed by high-powered water hoses and attacked by dogs.
Even you look at the 60s, right? That really is not that far removed. We're talking about my grandparents' generation and my parents' generation.
And I think it's very unfortunate that people who are in positions of power and influence will go to any means necessary or use any tactic that they possibly can to limit what somebody's trying to do for the good of not for just one community, but for all Americans.
So these were young people. These were school kids who were out protesting. And the fact that Bull Connor thought nothing of, injuring young people who were just fighting for equality speaks very poorly of the police.
You can never whip these boys if you don't keep you and them separate. I found that out in Birmingham. You've got to keep the white and the black separate.
And of course, these instances explain this history of difficulties between the African American community and other communities of color with the police.
King gets arrested and he's put in solitary confinement, and that's also, of course, when he writes a letter to the Birmingham jail around the edge of a newspaper.
And does not grapple with underlying causes. It is unfortunate that demonstrations are taking place in Birmingham, but it is even more unfortunate that the city's white power structure left the Negro community with no alternative.
They won't let him call his wife at first. Coretta is home from the hospital.